James Chen stared out the window of the transport ship, his heart racing as the gleaming spires of the Galactic Academy of Sciences came into view. The massive crystal towers of Centauri Prime sparkled like diamonds against the pink and purple sky, making Earth's tallest buildings look like children's toys in comparison. "All human passengers, please proceed to decontamination," a robotic voice announced overhead. James grabbed his worn backpack, the same one he'd used throughout his PhD studies on Earth, and headed to the designated area. He couldn't help but notice how the alien passengers whispered and pointed as he walked past. "Look at that primitive," one tall, blue-skinned alien muttered to another. "I heard they still use combustion engines on their planet." James kept his head high and smiled politely. He'd faced enough of these comments during the application process to know better than to react. Being the first human accepted into the Academy's exchange program meant dealing with plenty of prejudice, but he was determined to prove them wrong. The decontamination chamber hummed as it scanned him. A green light flashed, and the door opened to reveal a striking figure waiting on the other side. The alien woman stood nearly 7 feet tall, with silvery skin that seemed to shimmer in the light and long white hair that floated as if suspended in water. Her eyes were the most remarkable feature, completely black except for pinpoints of light that looked like stars. "I am Professor Ulzara," she said, her universal translator making her words sound slightly mechanical. "Welcome to the Galactic Academy of Sciences, Mr. Chen. I trust your journey was adequate." "It was fascinating, Professor," James replied honestly. "I've never seen a quantum drive in action before. The way it bent space-time was incredible." Professor Ulzara's expression shifted slightly. Was that surprise? Most species find their first quantum journey distressing. "Your enthusiasm is noted." She led him through corridors that seemed to be made of living crystal, explaining the Academy's rules and procedures. James tried to take everything in, but his attention was caught by a group of students in one of the research labs. Among them was a female alien unlike any he'd seen before. Her skin had a subtle purple tinge, and her hair looked like strands of starlight. "That is Research Group 7, Professor Ulzara explained. "Your assigned team." The purple-skinned alien looked up at that moment, her star-bright eyes meeting James's. For a split second, he felt a strange pressure in his head, like someone trying to push through a door. Then it vanished. "Interesting," Professor Ulzara murmured. "It seems Cthera's telepathic abilities cannot penetrate your mind. Most unusual." Cthera quickly looked away, but James caught a flash of frustration on her face. He'd read about telepathic species, but hadn't expected to meet one so soon. "Your quarters are this way," Professor Ulzara continued. "Classes begin tomorrow at first dawn. Do try not to embarrass your species, Mr. Chen." As James followed her down another crystal corridor, he couldn't help but smile. They all thought humans were primitive, simple creatures playing at being an advanced species, but he knew better. Humanity had survived and thrived because of their adaptability, their creativity, their determination, and he was going to show the galaxy exactly what a primitive human could do. What he didn't know was that the purple-skinned alien named Cthera was actually Princess Cthera of the Arcturus Empire, and that his immunity to her telepathy had just made him the most interesting creature she'd encountered in her royal life. The bioengineering lab hummed with energy as James entered for his first practical session. Various alien species worked at crystal-like stations that glowed with different colors. At the front of the room, Professor Ulzara was assigning lab partners. "Mr. Chen," she called out, her star-filled eyes fixing on him. "You'll be working with Cthera on Project Delta, analyzing dangerous pathogens from the outer rings." James noticed several alien students snickering. They probably thought the primitive human would mess up and get them all killed. He walked to his assigned station, where Cthera was already setting up equipment he'd never seen before. "You should wear protective gear," she said without looking up, her starlight hair floating gently around her face. "These pathogens are deadly to most species." "Most species," James repeated with a small smile, pulling on the protective suit. But humans have pretty strong immune systems. We evolved on a planet full of dangerous microbes. This made Cthera look up, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Is that why I cannot read your thoughts? Your biological defenses. Honestly, I have no idea, James admitted, but I'm more interested in why you keep trying. Cthera's purple skin darkened slightly. Was she blushing? I apologize. It's instinct for my people. We rarely meet minds we cannot access. They worked together for hours, with James surprising Cthera by suggesting unusual approaches to their research. While other species relied on advanced technology, he drew from Earth's primitive scientific methods, combining them with alien tech in ways nobody had considered. That's brilliant, Cthera admitted, watching as James used a simple Earth microscope alongside quantum sensors. The combined data is much clearer than our standard methods. As days passed, they fell into a comfortable routine. Cthera taught James about advanced alien science, while he shared human perspectives that she found surprisingly insightful. She began to look forward to their sessions, fascinated by this species that thought so differently from her own. But trouble was brewing. During one late-night session, James noticed Cthera seemed distracted. "Everything okay?" he asked, adjusting their experiment settings. "Yes, she paused, then spoke quietly. "James, what would you do if you had responsibilities you didn't want? Expectations you couldn't meet?" Before he could answer, 3 tall figures in formal attire entered the lab. Cthera immediately straightened, her casual demeanor vanishing. "You're high. I mean, Cthera," one of them spoke urgently. "There's been another threat. You must return to secure quarters immediately." James watched in confusion as Cthera was quickly led away. She glanced back at him once, her expression troubled. The next day, she acted as if nothing had happened, but James noticed new details he'd missed before. The way other students kept their distance, how there were always at least 2 students watching their lab station. The strange crystal pendant she wore that seemed to shimmer with energy. "You're not just a regular student, are you?" he asked quietly while they worked. Cthera's hands froze over their experiment. "James, there are things I cannot tell you. But please know that I enjoy working with you because you see me as just Cthera, not as someone else." James nodded, understanding there was more to the story. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, a group of rebel Arcturians were finalizing their plans to kidnap the princess, plans that would soon throw both their lives into chaos. Neither of them realized that their next sample collection trip to Centauri Prime's moons would change everything. The surface of Centauri Prime's largest moon glowed with a soft blue light. James and Cthera worked carefully, collecting samples of strange, crystalline fungi that grew in the moon's dark canyons. 2 security guards, who James now realized weren't really students, stood watch nearby. "These samples could help us understand how life adapts to extreme conditions," Cthera said, her special environment suit glittering under the starlight. James noticed she seemed tense today, constantly looking over her shoulder. Suddenly, the guards' communication devices crackled with static. "Something's wrong," one guard said, drawing what looked like a weapon. "The telepathic network is—" He never finished his sentence. A bright purple beam hit both guards, freezing them in place. Dark ships appeared from behind the canyon walls, their stealth systems powering down. James counted at least 6 of them. "Cthera, run," James shouted, grabbing her arm. His human instincts, what aliens called primitive survival responses, kicked in. Adrenaline flooded his system. "It's no use," Cthera said, her voice shaking. "They have telepathic dampeners. I can't call for help or defend myself." "Good thing I don't need telepathy to fight," James replied, pulling her behind a large crystal formation. Years of hiking and rock climbing on Earth had taught him to spot good cover instantly. Figures in black armor emerged from the ships. They moved with military precision, using technology James had never seen before. but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd prepared only for Arcturian resistance. "When I say now, run to that cave entrance," James whispered, picking up a piece of the crystalline fungi. He remembered something from their research. These fungi released powerful spores when broken. "But they'll see us," Cthera protested. "Trust me," James said, breaking the fungus. Bright blue spores filled the air, causing the attacker's sensors to go haywire. "Now," James grabbed Cthera's hand, and they ran. The attackers fired blindly, their shots going wide. James' primitive human ability to navigate without tech guides proved invaluable in the chaos. They'd reached the cave, but one attacker had managed to follow them. He raised his weapon, aiming at Cthera. Without thinking, James tackled the attacker. They rolled on the ground, fighting for control. The attacker was stronger, but seemed surprised by James's raw aggression and unpredictable fighting style. Earth's higher gravity had given James an advantage in strength that surprised even him. James managed to knock away the attacker's weapon and landed a solid punch, thankful for the boxing lessons he'd taken in college. The attacker stumbled back, his helmet cracking to reveal purple skin similar to Cthera's. "A human dares to strike an Arcturian noble," the attacker snarled. "This human dares a lot of things," James replied, standing protectively in front of Cthera. More attackers were approaching. Cthera grabbed James's arm. "There's another tunnel system behind us. I recognize the patterns. We can lose them in there." They ran deeper into the cave system as shots echoed behind them. James could hear their pursuers cursing as they struggled to follow in the dark tunnels. "I'm sorry," Cthera said as they ran. "I should have told you. I'm not just a student. I'm Princess Cthera of the Arcturus Empire," James finished. "Yeah, I figured that out. But right now, you're just my friend who needs help. We can talk about titles later." For the first time since the attack began, Cthera smiled. Then her face turned serious again. "We need to get off this moon. But they'll be watching all the official transport routes. Then we'll have to do this the human way," James said grimly. "We improvise." James and Cthera spent 3 days crossing Centauri Prime's harsh wilderness. They had stolen an old maintenance vehicle from an abandoned mining station, but had to abandon it when it ran out of power. Now they walked through a forest of crystal trees that chimed softly in the wind. "These trees are beautiful," James said, trying to keep Cthera's spirits up. She wasn't used to walking such long distances. "They remind me of wind chimes on Earth. On my homeworld, we have singing mountains," Cthera replied, her voice tired but curious. "But I've never been allowed to climb them. Princesses don't do such things." James helped her over a fallen crystal trunk. "Well, this princess is doing plenty of things she's not supposed to do. Like running through the wilderness with a primitive human." That made her laugh, then wince as she looked at her feet. Her royal boots weren't made for hiking. Without saying a word, James took off his outer shirt, tore it into strips, and wrapped them around her boots for extra cushioning. "You're ruining your clothes for me," she protested. "Humans are good at surviving with less," he said. "Besides, the temperature here feels like a nice spring day on Earth. Your people might be telepathic, but we evolved to walk long distances and adapt to different environments." As they walked, Cthera explained more about the political situation. A group of noble families wanted to keep the Arcturus Empire isolated from other species. They saw her father's diplomatic policies, like the exchange program, as a threat. "They must have been furious when you decided to study at the academy," James said, checking the position of the 3 suns to maintain their direction. "They were. But I wanted to understand other species, not just rule them." She looked at him thoughtfully. "I never expected to find a human so fascinating." Before James could respond, they heard the distant hum of search vehicles. They quickly hid under the dense crystal foliage as 3 ships passed overhead. "They're using standard search patterns," Cthera whispered. "My people always follow the most logical approach." "Then we'll be illogical," James grinned. Humans are great at that. Instead of heading straight to the nearest city like they expect, we'll go somewhere they won't think to look. Thera's eyes widened. The dead zone. But the crystal storms there disable all technology. Exactly. They can't use their telepathic powers or advanced tech there. We'll be on equal footing, just our natural abilities. As they changed direction toward the dead zone, Thera studied James with newfound respect. You know, my tutors taught me that humans were primitive because they relied on physical abilities instead of advanced technology. But I'm starting to think that makes you stronger, not weaker. We adapt, James said simply. It's what humans do best. Now, let me teach you how to find water by watching crystal formations. If I'm right, they grow differently near water sources, just like plants on Earth. They spent that evening in a small cave, where James showed Thera how to make a simple alarm system using loose crystal shards. She was amazed at how he could turn simple observations into survival tools. James, she said quietly as they prepared to rest, even if we survive this, you know a princess and a human. Let's focus on surviving first, he interrupted gently. Besides, I thought you wanted to change how your people see other species. Thera smiled and closed her eyes, feeling strangely safe despite their situation. She didn't know it yet, but their next discovery would change not just their lives, but the entire empire. The dead zone lived up to its name. The ground was covered in broken crystals, and strange electrical storms flashed in the purple sky above. James and Thera had been hiking through this dangerous area for a day when they found something unexpected. These aren't natural formations, James said, examining a row of damaged crystal pillars. They had found the ruins of what looked like an ancient building. Thera touched one of the pillars carefully. This is impossible. The history records say this area was always too dangerous for building. Unless, James said slowly, someone wanted people to think that. Look at these markings. They're not random damage. They're equations. Thera gasped. These are teleportation formulas, but they're far more advanced than anything we use today. She turned to James with wide eyes. This must be from the First Empire, before the Great Civil War that created the dead zone. James was about to respond when he noticed something odd about the storm patterns above them. Thera, these storms, they're not random. They're moving in a pattern, like they're being controlled. Using his knowledge of basic Earth physics and Thera's understanding of Arcturian technology, they began to piece together a disturbing truth. The dead zone wasn't natural. It was a massive ancient machine, still running after centuries. The rebels, Thera realized, her voice shaking. They found this place first. They're not just trying to kidnap me. They're trying to reactivate the old Empire's weapons. They found an old control room filled with dusty but still functioning equipment. James recognized some basic energy patterns from his Earth studies. We need to warn your father, he said. If they activate this technology, it could start another civil war. Thera began working with the ancient communications equipment while James kept watch. His human eyes, better adapted to working in low light than Arcturian ones, spotted movement outside. Someone's coming, he whispered. They worked faster. Thera managed to connect to the Imperial emergency frequency, but just as she began transmitting their warning, the door exploded inward. How predictable, said a cold voice. The rebel leader stepped through the dust, followed by armed guards. The princess and her pet human, trying to be heroes. Lord Vicara, Thera said, stepping forward. Uncle, why are you doing this? Because your father is weak. Vicara spat. Making peace with primitives, sharing our technology. The old empire knew that we were meant to rule, not cooperate. James watched the guards carefully. Their weapons weren't working well in the dead zone, but they still outnumbered them. You're wrong about humans, Thera said firmly. They're not primitive. They're different. James has shown me that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. Like this, James added, throwing a handful of broken crystal shards at the ceiling lights. The room plunged into darkness. In the chaos that followed, James's human night vision gave him an advantage. He managed to knock down 2 guards while Cthera, who had been practicing some of his primitive fighting moves, handled another. But Vikera grabbed Cthera, holding a blade to her throat. "Stupid human, you cannot stop us." What happened next would become legend in the Arcturus Empire, because at that moment, Cthera realized something that changed everything. She had fallen in love with James Chen, the primitive human who had shown more nobility than any royal suitor. And that realization was about to save both their lives. Time seemed to freeze as Vikera held the blade to Cthera's throat. In the dim light of the ancient control room, James could see the fear in her eyes, not fear for herself, but for him. "Your primitive friend can't help you now," Vikera sneered, pressing the blade closer. "Surrender, or the princess dies." But Vikera had made a critical mistake. Like most Arcturians, he assumed a human without technology was helpless. He didn't know about Earth's long history of hand-to-hand combat, or how humans could think fastest when under pressure. "Actually," James said calmly, "you made 3 mistakes." He took a step forward, making Vikera focus on him. "First, you brought a knife to a physics fight." Before Vikera could respond, James grabbed a broken crystal from the floor and threw it at the ancient control panel. Sparks flew, and the room's gravity suddenly shifted. Vikera, not expecting this, loosened his grip on Cthera for just a second. Second, James continued, as Cthera slipped free and rolled away. "You forgot humans evolved as pursuit predators. We're really good at planning while moving." Vikera raised his blade, but James was already moving. He ducked under the swing and tackled Vikera into a wall. The impact sent them both crashing through into another chamber filled with humming crystal machinery. And third, James grunted as they fought, "You assumed I was alone." At that moment, the wall exploded. Imperial guards poured in, their weapons modified to work in the dead zone thanks to Cthera's partial transmission. Vikera's remaining followers found themselves surrounded. But Vikera wasn't finished. He broke free from James and ran to the ancient machine's core. "If I can't rule the Empire, no one will." He began smashing crystals, causing the entire structure to shake. "He's overloading the power core," Cthera shouted. "The explosion will destroy everything for miles." James looked at the pulsing crystal core, then at the equations carved on the walls. His human brain, evolved to find patterns and solve problems quickly, made connections that even the advanced Arcturians missed. "The crystals," he said, "they're like the fungi we studied. They respond to damage by trying to heal themselves. If we can redirect the energy." He ran to the core, ignoring Cthera's scream of warning. Vikera tried to stop him, but Imperial guards held him back. James placed his hands on the crystals, remembering everything he'd learned about their properties. The pain was immediate and intense. Energy coursed through his body as he forced the crystals to redirect their power upward into the storm above. His primitive nervous system, more flexible than an Arcturian's, could handle the overload, barely. The storm above the dead zone turned into a spectacular light show as the energy dispersed harmlessly into space. When it was over, James collapsed. "James." Cthera ran to him, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you do that? You could have died." "Because," he whispered, his voice weak but smiling, "somebody had to prove humans aren't as primitive as everyone thinks." As Imperial medics rushed to help him, Cthera held his hand tightly. She didn't care that her uncle was being arrested, or that her father's guards were watching. She knew at that moment that her life, and her empire, would never be the same. James survived, though the energy left strange, crystal-like scars on his hands. But those scars would soon become symbols of something much bigger than one human's bravery. They would become the beginning of a change that would transform the Arcturus Empire forever. 2 months after the battle in the Dead Zone, James stood before the Arcturus Imperial Court. His crystal-scarred hands glowed faintly as he adjusted the formal robes, Cthera had insisted he wear. The massive crystal throne room was packed with nobles, many still looking at him with disapproval. James Chen of Earth, Emperor Viller's voice echoed through the chamber. You stand before us accused of a most serious crime. James kept his face calm, though his heart raced. Cthera, standing beside her father's throne, gave him a secret smile. You have, the emperor continued, completely disrupted thousands of years of imperial tradition. A small smile crossed his face. And for that, we thank you. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the court. The emperor stood, his crystal crown catching the light. My daughter has taught me that change is necessary for growth. This human, whom many called primitive, showed more wisdom and courage than those born to power. He proved that true nobility comes from actions, not birth. Lord Vicara and his conspirators were brought in, bound in energy chains. These nobles thought power came from isolation and superiority. They were wrong. Real power comes from understanding and adapting, something humans seem to excel at. Cthera stepped forward. Father, I request permission to speak. The emperor nodded, his eyes twinkling as if he knew what was coming. I love James Chen, she announced to the court. And I don't care if he's human. He has shown us that different doesn't mean inferior. His so-called primitive traits are exactly what saved our empire. More murmurs, but this time mixed with thoughtful nods. James's actions in the Dead Zone had become legendary, with many young Arcturians now studying primitive human techniques alongside their advanced technology. The law says a princess must marry nobility, one old council member protested. Then we'll change the law, Cthera replied firmly. Just like we're changing how we see other species. The emperor raised his hand for silence. James Chen stepped forward. James walked to the throne, remembering how far he'd come from being that nervous exchange student. You have taught us much about human adaptability, courage, and wisdom. Therefore, I name you Lord James Chen, first human noble of the Arcturus Empire, and grant you my blessing to marry my daughter. The ceremony that followed was a blend of human and Arcturian traditions, and 9 months later, something happened that changed the galaxy forever. Cthera gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl with slightly purple skin and James's brown eyes. The children grew up with both their father's quick thinking and their mother's telepathic gifts. They could survive in harsh conditions like humans, but read minds like Arcturians. They became living proof that different species could not only coexist, but create something new and wonderful together. Years later, James watched his children playing in the palace gardens, using their unique abilities to create games no pure human or Arcturian could have imagined. Do you ever miss being just a regular PhD student? Cthera asked, taking his scared hand in hers. Sometimes, James admitted. But then I remember that being primitive turned out to be my greatest strength. Our children will help build a future where no species is considered primitive, just different. The crystal scars on his hands glowed warmly, a permanent reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures start with a simple exchange program and the courage to see beyond prejudice. And somewhere in the galaxy, a young Arcturian noble was applying to study on Earth, wondering what other primitive wisdom there was to learn.